All right, I think for the sake of time, we have a good number of folks in here already. We'll go ahead and get started so that we can stay within the hour and again allow some time for questions afterwards. Really appreciate everyone joining us here today. I can't see myself on video the way my screen is set up, but I believe I am on video. I will not hold it against you if you go ahead and minimize that. I'll leave it open in case some of you like to see who's talking through this, but it's certainly not my area of strength being on video. So we've put together a deck for me to walk through with you that I hope is really going to give you all the information today. At the end of all this, we will share the deck and a recording of this webinar with you. So if something comes up, you have to go early or take a pause, don't worry, we'll be able to get you all caught up. I do also appreciate that where we are at today is by no means where we expected to be when we first set up this webinar several weeks ago. Obviously, a great amount has changed in the world since then. And really, in your space specifically with higher ed, the focus is on a number of things that we had not anticipated, not necessarily how can you measure more and do more with your digital strategy. Really, a lot of you are probably looking to how to grow your online offerings, how to make sure you have classes to offer, how to engage your current and future students in this time of this COVID pandemic. I'm going to speak to that wherever possible. I'm also happy to answer questions specific to that as they come up during this. But I do want to preface this by saying that the beauty of what we've put together today is really universal to whatever's going on. Maybe more helpful now than ever, because what I want you to take away from today is if you're doing any digital marketing for enrollment at all, this is going to be a great way to measure it a little bit better and see the impact of it and be a little more efficient with it. So if we're talking about a long-term scenario where maybe budgets are cut back a little bit, where maybe the the prospective student journey changes a little bit, elongates some, what we're going to talk through today actually plays into that very well. So happy to answer things from a marketing perspective about this COVID pandemic situation. If you like, this is your time to ask those things while we have you today. But I think what we're going to learn here today is hopefully very universal no matter what. So really what we're talking about here is not just uncovering your cost per student, it's uncovering what is your marketing spend digitally doing for you at the end of the day for what actually matters. What is it giving you in terms of enrollments and students, and how can you turn that information into a more efficient enrollment generation strategy? There are a lot of things that feed into this, so a bit of an ambitious agenda today. I'm going to try and fire through some of the simple things and spend a little more time on some of the technical side. So again, fire questions into the Q&A at any point. I'll see them pop up and we'll address them as they come. I don't want this to be a sales meeting, so I'm not going to focus much on who Statwax is. One slide and that's it. I am Brian. I'm the president of Statwax. We are located in Indianapolis, Indiana. We have an office in Dallas, Texas as well. And we focus on higher education. We are a full service digital agency, but behind everything we do is a data-driven approach. We use some of the things we're going to walk through today so that when we go into schools, we don't tell them we're going to get them X number of applicants and just leave it at that. We're going to walk through with our clients how they can see what those applicants actually turned into, what digital touch points they had along the way, and what every penny of ad spend that funneled through Statwax actually gave them in terms of what matters most to their school. So we do that by looking at the entire student journey, because nothing in getting a prospect from research to enrollment happens in a single day or a single touch point. This is some data from a Google study. Google commissioned this study back in 2017. It was the last time that they did one of this size. I know it's been a couple of years, but this is the most comprehensive data that they had on the student marketing journey. Now, this is holistic to all types of schools: online, for-profit, community college, traditional. The numbers would change slightly if you segmented out just online distance education, just for-profits, just nursing programs. They wanted a nationwide look at the state of higher ed as a whole. And what it found is that on average, a prospective student is going to start with just a hair under an average of 4 schools and about 3 programs in mind. Now that's an average, so obviously no one's going to consider half of a school, but you can see if they crunch the numbers how it comes out to a decimal there. On average, your prospects are looking at multiple schools, but right off the bat, it's not 7, 8, 12, it's 4, a little under. So you need to be positioned with those digital touch points early on to make the cut right off the bat, because more than half of those prospects are going to immediately turn to search when they start researching. And over time, they're going to narrow their choice to under 3, and then they're going to decide between 2. Now, the data says that these days, a lot of prospects, especially rising high school seniors, will apply to 7, 8 of them. That's certainly true, but on the whole, across your adult learners, your high school seniors, every type of student, every type of school, they end up deciding between 2 on average. And 75% of them, a full 3/4 of your prospects, are never going to widen their search again, which offers insight into why it's so important to have multiple digital touch points and multiple marketing points along the way to engage these folks. Because the other key data points that came out of the study, the average prospect requires 10,000 marketing touch points from beginning to the point of actually becoming a student. Again, this is a Google study, grain of salt. Anything that Google says, I'm not going to take it 100% face value, but there's a lot of truth in this. It was a third-party study they commissioned. This is not just digital. This is marketing. So every email you send, every postcard, every organic social media post, and then every comment from a friend that the prospect looks at, every single time they have a marketing touch point with your school adds up to an average of 10,000 to get your normal prospect to make a decision. To put it in perspective, the same study was done for buying a car. That came out to about 7,500. So that makes sense. Choosing a school to spend a chunk of your life and really set your adult life in motion is a pretty big decision. What we're trying to paint a picture of here is that it's a messy student journey. There are a lot of touch points to measure. And even if you're measuring a lot of those, once someone applies or inquires at your school, there's so much that happens afterwards. Those touch points continue until the point they actually start classes. So the ideal way of looking at it is this spaghetti bowl of touch points of marketing. And then once they become a lead, an application, however you want to consider them, it flattens out a little bit because you're moving through almost a sales process with admissions reps, with advisors. Maybe they're disqualified right off the bat, bad information, duplicate, etc. But ideally, you can see all of it. But when it comes to figuring out what your marketing dollars are giving you and what your digital is giving you, we find that there's often this gap, this gray area. Even if a school is measuring all of the touch points that are creating applications, oftentimes what they're missing is what happens afterward. We find a lot of agencies take this approach. It's why we've sort of built the Statwax name and how we sell ourselves on this concept of taking it far beyond application or inquiry or lead volume. What really matters is, did they become students? Were they retained? Did they eventually graduate? And of those great alumni and great students, what were all the touch points and all the spins that made them happen? Versus applicants who on the surface look good, and then it turns out they don't enroll, or there's bad information there, and they don't proceed downstream to what's really important. So this is what we're going to talk about today. Where do we end up with this? We end up optimizing everything we do for the student and the graduate, not for the lead. Throwing cost per lead essentially out the window when we evaluate digital strategies. It becomes a vanity metric. Lead volume is great, cost per lead is great. Student volume, cost per student, cost per enrollment, that's what's even better, because there are leads out there that are not turning into anything. And so at the end of the day, what we always say to a school is, do you want 100 applications and 1 becomes a student, or do you want 50 applications and 25 become students? And typically that's the direction they go. It's about student volume. Now there's always discussions about, well, we still have lead volume goals to hit. Our admissions reps, especially in the for-profit space, still have lead volume. That's all fine and good. You have to have a massive budget to be getting all the possible leads out there. So we can always still have the lead volume conversation while optimizing that lead volume to produce better outcomes for you if we're tracking it properly. Attribution is what makes it all go. If you've spent any time in the digital space and within these platforms, you've probably encountered these various attribution models. By default, right now, we find too many schools are still using last touch point attribution. They're saying whatever the last thing that got someone to our website to fill out an application was, that's the thing we give credit to. And if that applicant becomes a student, then that final touch point was the end all be all of success. Unfortunately, when there's an average of 10,000 touch points in the mix, that really doesn't paint any actionable picture for you, because what it's eliminating is, what are your different lead types? Does the same paid search keyword that generates an application versus a live chat lead to the same outcome all of the time? Is it as valuable for one lead versus another? What is the conversion rate of those leads to students for each individual channel, each ad variation, all of that? If you're just looking at last touch point and you're running a lot of paid search, it's probably going to tell you that your branded search is doing everything for you and you should stop everything else. Obviously, we know that's probably a bad idea because we've encountered attribution some, but so many schools are still taking this approach, and it paints a very fuzzy picture. You also aren't going to figure out which of those touch points are getting you the best quality leads. That's where the volume conversation comes into play. There could be two different ways to generate 50 leads a piece. One of them might convert at twice the rate to enrollments as the other, and you need to know what those nuances are, what levers in your digital strategy to pull. And then once you are collecting the data, how can you actually make it actionable so that you can get more efficient along the way? So we talked about the problem with the final touch point attribution. The future state, what we want to get to is, when you look in your ad platform, when you look at your Google ads, your paid search, you're seeing incrementally every single downstream touch point that every single ad variation, every single keyword helped generate. If this broad keyword helped play a role in 1/5 of an eventual enrollment, you want to know that incremental value, because it's not just a yes or no scenario. You need to know what everything did to get a piece of credit along the way. If you spent time in Google Analytics, you've seen these assisted channels where you can look and see what were all of the previous touch points that led to a conversion. Most schools might look at it, and most agencies might just count that as application. Let's say we're looking at this image right here, and it's just all of the touch points that led to an applicant. What if you could, in Google Analytics, see this same type of chart, but instead of applicants, look at it for scheduled interviews, enrollments, starts, graduates? We can do all of that with a little bit of integration. Same thing here. What if you could see the average length in website interactions, the average amount of time from first visit to last that produced not just a website conversion, but also an interview, enrollment, etc., those valuable offline conversions? It all comes down to your CRM. And with your CRM, it does not matter which one you use. We have done this with schools who use a homegrown one that they created in-house with some savant who never sleeps, who just coded it out from scratch. We've worked with schools who use Slate, HubSpot, Salesforce, Velocify. At the end of the day, your average CRM is going to allow the integrations and the custom fields that we need to make all this happen. And all of the ad platforms and all of the touch points are going to let you do this part as well fairly easily. And it's a good bet this is the part. A lot of you may already be doing some. So I won't spend a whole ton of time on this part. But what it's going to do is it's going to kickstart this process for us, because we're going to take all the attributes you might want to track and feed them into your CRM, so that when a lead is created in your CRM and begins moving through that offline process with admissions, advisors, etc., you can go back to that lead and see what are the items that got them there that you want to track? What was the keyword? What was the ad content, the channel, the source, etc.? This is the first part. Excuse me. So what makes this happen? On all of your digital touch points, I know I say on the ad URLs, but I really want you to consider this for any digital that you're putting a link out there. So if you run organic social for your school, you can do this on your organic posts as well. I'm going to speak to it in an ad scenario. You can put tracking parameters on your URLs. If you've ever used UTM parameters, same thing, except you can go way beyond those. But at the end of the day, whatever tracking parameters you set up, you're going to pull through your lead capture, whether it's an inquiry form like the Statwax example I'm showing you here, or a full-on multi-page application. You can pull those parameters through, and I'll show you how, and then pass them when that lead or application gets submitted and creates an entry in your CRM. You can pass those tracking parameters to your CRM and populate that lead with all of this information. So this is just a very basic example of something that doesn't even use UTM parameters. This is a statwax.com ad in Google search and Google search ads. You can see we use source ID equals and code right there. We do this for a lot of clients where we create custom codes that refer to a specific channel, date, campaign, etc. It does not have to be just UTMs. If you can think it, you can put it on and then send it through into your CRM. So we have a question. Are you expecting that your CRM has direct connection with the SIS already, or are colleges using a CRM only instead of an SIS? So it really depends. We have encountered a number of different scenarios because we know a lot of schools pass information from the CRM directly into additional internal systems and student management systems and all of that. Our expectation is not that those connections are always there, simply because the schools typically that we work with, even if things happen in separate systems, the key information, the key milestones are still being matched in the CRM. So to be honest with you, we typically don't leave the CRM for the work that we do, even if stuff is happening in a management system elsewhere. If they become a student or become a graduate, that milestone at least gets flagged back into the CRM. Now, there are unique scenarios where once it leaves like a Salesforce and goes over to admissions and all of that, it is totally handled on that side. That's something that we could certainly work through at what to pass back and forth. We have not encountered that typically. We typically work entirely within the CRM, but we know that every college and every system does have a lot of other systems and integrations in place, and that's something I think we could definitely work through. If I'm misinterpreting the question there, John, please feel free to type and let me know, but I believe that's what you're getting at. And the reason we work entirely in the CRM is, again, because so much of the tracking and the parameters are set up on the ad side or on the digital side if you're doing organic. So this is an example where you don't even have to hard code out what the parameter is. In this first example, we chose source ID equals 18 AWS1. We put that in there because that was something we came up with. Google and Bing especially have templates built. You can actually set it so that the URL that it uses on the ad automatically pulls variables in and sends them with the click based on what the user did. It's called value track parameters. So you can set it up so that every ad click in Google automatically fires a parameter for the device type, desktop, tablet, mobile, for the ad position that it showed up in. So you can actually evaluate very easily out of your CRM, do ad positions 1 and 2 produce students more often than 3 and 4? My guess would be yes, but those are things you can look at. The IDs behind every campaign, ad creative, the user location, the keyword, all of these things, you could literally put 20 tracking parameters on your URLs and then set up your website and your lead capture to grab them and fire them into the next system, into your internal system. But there is some work you have to do first. By default, if you were to launch a site right now and then fire ad clicks to it with parameters, just as you see in this image here, they will appear when the site loads. Everyone's seen those when you click a tracked URL. What happens when you click to the next page? They disappear. They're not in the address bar anymore, which means by default, if you just from scratch build a website and you put a form on a page and people start clicking around and then fill out that form, without a little bit of extra setup, that form is not going to know what parameters to grab anymore. You have to set it up so that when someone visits your website, that tracking stays with them just like a cookie does. This is how Google Analytics work. It puts things in a session cookie that follows the user from page to page for as long as they're there. You have to set it up so that your unique parameters also travel from page to page so that when your lead capture is ready to grab them, it can. There are two ways to do this. I won't get on today's webinar into the specifics. I welcome you to reach out specifically if you want to really get into the nitty gritty, because I don't think enough people here want to go into coding and stuff today. I will say there are two main ways to do this. One, PHP to create a session variable. This is going to be a little more developer heavy. PHP is obviously going to be some server side coding and all of that. You can basically set PHP that when a user arrives on your site with your tracking parameters in the URL, it grabs them, stores them in a session variable. That session variable will follow that user for the entire time they're on the website. Or you can use Google Tag Manager. There are several plugins and tutorials out there where you can use GTM to create a session cookie that does the same thing. When they come in, it grabs whatever parameters are in the URL, stores them in a cookie, and then you can set your form up to call to that session variable or cookie and pull those parameters out. There's even a Google Tag Manager way of basically saying every time they click a link to another page on the website, just grab those tracking parameters and put them on the URL when it loads again. That slows the load time down ever so slightly, so I tend to avoid that because we have folks in-house who can script out the more complex way, but there are easier and harder ways of doing this. But at the end of the day, what you need to do is get your tracking parameters into a session variable or cookie, and then set up your form to grab them. Because what you'll find, go to any website, any like major company, even your own school might be already doing this for some variables. Look at their lead capture forms. Look at what they're capturing that's visible that you fill out. Then view their page source. Look for how many elements in that form are listed with a value type of hidden. These are the things that your form can pull your tracking parameters from. Now, if you're using a PHP for like a session variable, your developer is going to need to code out some additional PHP for the form post or get to call that variable. I'm going to be candid. I'm speaking on things in the PHP side above my head and pay grade because I'm not a developer by trade. We have someone who does that part. On Google Tag Manager, there are easier ways to call the variables from a session cookie. So that's the way I tend to default a little bit. But at the end of the day, what you need your form to do is pass those parameters as hidden values. Because when you do that, you're going to have fields in your CRM ready to grab those. So you can do it one of two ways. If it's a brand new parameter that you want to track, create a custom field in the CRM for it. Go into Salesforce and create a custom field that's called paid search keyword or add position. Or you can just map the incoming variable. You can say, you know what, I want source ID to map in my existing Salesforce field to the traffic source field that's already there. If you don't want to create new fields on your CRM entries, you can just map the incoming data to a new one. If you're not in charge of your if you're not in charge of your CRM, your admin would be able to do this because they've already set up your lead capture initially. Somehow or another, someone has already set up that your program selection or your first name and last name on the application are going to map to some field in your CRM. So they're the ones to turn to help map the additional parameters in. You're just sending more information in there. Now, when you do that, you're only part way to our total solution that we want to get to, but already you're going to be able to pull some neat reports from your CRM. Already you're going to be able to start looking and seeing which channels as a last touch point. Keep this in mind. This is still just on the last touch point attribution. What were the final channels, final keywords, ad position, etc., whatever those parameters are, that generated entries in my CRM, and then you can start looking downstream and pull reports. Say if you're in HubSpot, pull a deal stages report and say, which channels that produced leads or applicants for me ended up turning into enrollments or interviews or students at a better rate. That's a great first step. If you're not doing that yet, you're already a good step forward, but you're still on last touch point attribution, because all we have just set up is take whatever the last thing that got someone to your website is, and whatever parameters are on that, put them in when you create the new entry in your CRM. So that actually doesn't solve the attribution piece for us. It gives you a little better idea of which final touch points are converting lead to student at a better rate, and gives you a little better idea maybe of some of the costs associated. What we really want to be able to see is if there were 10 paid search keywords that drove me to your website over a period of 30 days, which ones played what role in me eventually becoming a student? Did all of them? When did they occur? And we want to see that across everything. That is where we move everything we've just created from your CRM back into your ads and into Google Analytics. Because this is the great part. We just flow data from ads or from digital touch points into CRM using some tracking parameters we built. The data goes both ways. Also, regardless of what CRM you use, Salesforce is going to be a little bit easier, but no matter which one you use, even if it's a homegrown one, you'll be able to do this. And again, what is the goal of this? It's to make it so that when you go into your ad platforms, you can start seeing not just what created a lead, but incrementally what created everything that came after that. And you can start making decisions based on those deeper level outcomes. So if you're running paid search right now, and let's say you have a target CPA bidding strategy based on an ideal cost per lead, you'll literally be able to change your target CPA bidding based on your ideal cost per enrollment and have the platform start optimizing toward that. That's the kind of outcome we're looking for. Make lead a vanity metric and optimize for your enrollments and your students. This is a great example of what could happen there. On last touch attribution in Google Ads, it might see that both branded searches produced an enrollment, so they both get the same value. There's no difference in either of these scenarios. If you bring all the touch points back together and start being able to see, you know what, when someone first searched financial aid and then did these things, they converted to an enrollment 1% better every time. That means this financial aid keyword in the grand scheme of things should actually be valued a little bit higher, and we should make sure that we have some budget toward it, that our search impression share on it is good, that our audiences are, tweaked accordingly. You're starting to open up these bigger picture items a little bit. But right now, a lot of schools can only see it for applicants or inquiries, that first shallow conversion. We want to see it for enrollments and students. Once you do all of this, what you'll be able to do is create these individual metrics within your ad platforms and start to see every single thing in there. So then you can start to get really granular and say, you know what, this phrase match of this keyword actually had a better application to enrollment rate and a better cost per enrollment than the phrase match version of this other keyword. Like, you can get super granular with it, but you first have to get that information out of the CRM. The CRM is where those milestones live. So I'll start with Salesforce. It's the 800-pound gorilla. So of course, places like Google have an automatic integration with it. Something like Bing, I don't believe still does. So everything else we'll talk about would probably work for every other platform. But if Google, being the mammoth display video and search platform, we'll kind of start with that one. If you have Salesforce, you can go into your setup, into linked accounts, and start an integration with Salesforce right off the bat. It will walk you through the steps, but in a nutshell, here's what you're going to be doing. It's all about the GCL ID, the Google Click ID. Every time someone clicks an ad in Google, it fires a unique long string of numbers and letters called the GCL ID. You can see them if you click a search ad of any random one, you'll see it appear in your URL. What you'll end up doing here to integrate Salesforce is you will use pre-written code that Google has already made for you. When you get this deck, there's a link right to it. No reason to do any developing, wizardry. Google made it for us. Putting that snippet on your website in the header so it deploys, or via GTM so it deploys across every page, will make it so when anyone lands on your website and it sees a GCL ID, it will store it in a session cookie. It will do those things that we've already been doing with the other parameters. It will do it automatically just for that ID number. Then your form will be set up to grab it just as it did the other hidden values and pass it just like all the other hidden parameters into a GCL ID field in Salesforce. That's all it needs. If you use Salesforce, get that GCL ID from your ad clicks into your Salesforce entries, and this automated integration will help link up and handle the rest and start bringing. It will allow you to choose every milestone, every stage that you see in your exact Salesforce platform right now. It will let you choose every one of those and import them back into Google Ads as individual conversions that you can then optimize toward, split out into individual custom columns, and analyze and take action on. I know there's a little code involved, but it really is that easy because it's all done for you except for actually putting that snippet on there and modifying your form to capture it. So thank you, Salesforce, for being a billion-dollar company and integrating with another billion-dollar company. A lot of the rest of us aren't that lucky because we're not on Salesforce. HubSpot, Slate, Velocify, all of Hobson's Radius, all of those, you can still do this. It just takes some different code. So for everything that's not Salesforce, there's not just a pre-written in Google Ads, like here's step 1, step 2. You can find it in Google documentation, but I'll lay it out pretty concisely for you here. What you're going to capture instead in this case is the Google Analytics ID. So if someone lands on your website and you have Google Analytics, they are tagged with an ID. This is how Google Analytics tracks and runs all of their sessions. This is how you go back into analytics and start seeing months after the fact what individual users did. If you're ever bored, go into Google Analytics and go into Behaviors User Explorer, and you'll see all these ID numbers in there. Those are individuals. GA will not give us personal identification information. They won't show us this person was Brian Walker who did this, this, and this, but they will give you all these analytics ID numbers in that User Explorer. That's what's assigned to someone when they land on a website. Once again, Google wrote the code. It's just a snippet, a piece of JavaScript. You put it on your site, and what it will do is it will store as a client ID variable what that analytics ID is. Your form then grabs it and passes it into the CRM, just like the GCL ID, just like any other parameter we made. So again, both instances, Salesforce and otherwise, we have taken a concept of all these tracking parameters and we've just added one more to it. The final one we added just happens to be one that Google created themselves. And this is the magic piece that's going to tie it all together. Now, don't glaze over when you look at this. I tend to as well. Just hear me out and we'll talk through it a little bit. This is where if you have a developer or an agency, is my one plug here for today, that does it themselves for you, it really comes in handy. Google Analytics has an API. There's a lot you can do with it. This one is called the measurement protocol. You can Google this and fall down a rabbit hole, but just know it's called the measurement protocol. It allows you to build a custom URL and fill in things like your Google Analytics ID and the client ID that you just grabbed, the GAID number that you just grabbed as a new parameter, and fill in these things and fire it back into GA and create an event every time you fire it. So what this would do, it would create an event. It would do it in the analytics account that you specify. It would match the event to the user of the ID number that you grabbed, and it would name the event lead, demo set, yada, yada, whatever you want for the event, like category label and all that. You can build all that out every single time. So if I filled in that piece and this piece right here and clicked it, it would load up a blank page, but it would actually create an event right then and there in that analytics account. It's called the hit builder. If you've ever used Google's URL builder to build out UTMs, you can actually go to the hit builder and build out these by specifying what you want to name your event, all the parameters, what the client ID for GA is, and what your GA account is. So here's where the magic happens. In your CRM or in your system, and it's going to be wildly different for various systems, and this is the part that, to avoid people getting too bored, I won't go into every single one. I'll just say that work with your system administrator and or your developer. We create a script that basically runs daily from the CRM, typically at the end of the day, middle of the night, whenever, using a batch method, and basically over and over for any newly created or changed milestones in the CRM, it will build these over and over and fire them out. At the end of the day, what that script is doing when it runs every night, it's taking every single user ID that we have grabbed, and it's going to pull into the naming conventions of the event, whatever those milestones in the CRM are, and fire them. And because we're using the client ID that matches that user up in GA, it will create the event on that specific user's entire website journey for you. So what it will basically do, I'll come back to that in a second, is create all these events for every milestone: raw lead, qualified, contacted, enrolled, interview set, whatever you have. It'll create those events and it will attach them to the individual sessions because of that ID number in GA, which means now that you can go into GA at any point and, looking at those events, split out and say, what source mediums got me the most interviews and enrollments? What keywords got the best conversion rate from one to the other? What ads, what, in channels, what geographical locations, devices? Any of those reports you pull in GA that you look at a goal or an event outcome, you can now do that. But the events you're looking at are your CRM milestones, like enrollments or student who started. This is very busy. It is very developer heavy. There's a lot when I say, I realize, schedule a script to run in the CRM with a batch method to fire these into GA every night. I know that's a lot. There are a couple other solutions. My preferred method, ask our developer, they script it out. Based on your CRM, Zapier could also do this as well. If you're not familiar with Zapier, we can talk offline. It's a wonderful program. It's very inexpensive. They've basically built out a lot of code as go-betweens of various systems. Like if you use HubSpot, we have a HubSpot client right now. We turned to Zapier and basically built it out so that every time a deal in HubSpot changes to a new deal stage, it fires it right into Google Analytics and Google Ads as a new event and conversion. It does the matching up for us without a lot of that back end code. There's a little more control if you build all this out yourself. You can really set a lot more, we find, and choose how often it takes place and all. But in a pinch, Zapier has actually made it really, really easy. You probably won't be able to use it on very obscure CRMs or homegrown systems or any of that. But if you don't have an agency or internal IT dev folks, this is a great place to look to still help you accomplish a lot of what we're talking about. Because at the end of the day, what we want to do is get those events into GA. That's the first step here. Because if you're familiar with GA, once it's in there, you can get it into your ads. So take these events. We're firing now. So let's use this hypothetical. Every night we're firing new events into GA that are attaching themselves to the actual users and sessions that first created them. So when someone becomes an enrollment, that source, medium, campaign, keyword, all those things now have an event tied to it that's enrollment. We can look at that session, that person, and we can look all the way back and see all of the prior touch points that led to that as well. All of those assists that we looked at early on in this deck, we can start looking at those multi-channel touch points. That's where the magic starts to happen. It's no longer last click because it's in GA and it's tied to that session and that user ID. All their previous stuff that was happening all fills in, because analytics is always tying those things together and building that journey for us. That's the magic behind all this. And once an event is in Google Analytics, you can turn it into a goal. Happy to walk through this with you at the end if you haven't seen how to do this before. But in GA, any events that you have, you can create a new goal and say, when an event named this, this, and this happens, make it a conversion goal. Why would we do that if the event is already in there? Simple, because once it's a goal, you can import it very easily into your Google Ads platform, or into Bing Ads as it were, even Facebook now and stuff. So once it's a goal, bring it back into the ad platform, and when you do that, that's when you can start creating your custom columns and creating your custom optimizations and attributions. So right here are two that I just pulled a quick screenshot. I know that demo is not something, for higher ed, but you can go into Google Ads, go in and customize your columns, build out sample ones that say, close customer over demo set, and call it lead to demo conversion rate or demo to customer conversion rate. You can build out ones that say enrollment, that say interview scheduled, and all of these different things, because it's all in there. And what you're going to start to find, oh no, it's right there for you. Sorry. What you're going to start to find, if you set your attribution to something that's not last click, look at all of the incremental conversions here. That's what's really great, because now that the whole journey from applicant to enrollment or whatever you're tracking in your CRM, now that it's fully in Google Analytics, you can then bring all of those as goals into Google Ads, turn on the attribution modeling, and start to see which keywords got incremental value along the way, because it's then going to start taking that eventual enrollment and saying, well, that enrollment had 10 different keywords that played a role at some point, so let's give 1/10 of its value to each of them, or split it however you want to set up your attribution model. You're no longer looking at just, yes, it's an enrollment or no, and yes, it was the last touch point or not, so we can't see it. You're looking at literally every piece of value that every touch point in your digital strategy had, and thus able to also ascertain the true value of every dollar that was spent on those clicks. If it's the broadest, most early awareness building keyword, you can still see that 90 days later, it had 20% of the value of the enrollment that eventually happened. And when you start to do that, the reports you can create and the optimizations you can decide on are so much bigger than where we first started, when all we were looking at was application or lead volume. Because once your attribution model is set and the platforms are seeing that true downstream approach, that's when you can change your bidding strategies and say, you know what, this is what I want to pay per enrollment. And it's going to start using those incremental value points and all the data signals available to ascertain whether or not to serve up ads for this very broad keyword. Or at this time of day that maybe on the surface doesn't look like it converts well, but actually 90 days from now, it leads to students at a far better rate. It's going to start making those decisions that previously you really couldn't see. And then that is going to show you your true cost per student from these digital efforts. I spent $100 last week on this very broad keyword and it didn't produce any enrollments. Well, in the old way of doing things, probably not, because it's touch point number 300 of 10,000. But when you have that journey tied together that way and you start seeing the incremental downstream impact fill in days and weeks later, all of a sudden touch point 300 looks pretty valuable, because down the line it's actually turning into enrollments. That $100 actually played a role in 4 enrollments. So that's actually a very efficient and acceptable keyword for me. These are the things we start doing. I'm speaking on keywords a lot, but you can look at it on any granular level. Ad variation, ad group, campaign, audience, if you have different remarketing audiences, affinity audiences on your display ads, anything you can look at and attach metrics to that it will show you conversions on, this kind of setup will pull it in and show that to you. So I went a few minutes past what I wanted to allow some time for questions, especially knowing we flew through some of the coding. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. If you have any, please feel free to fire them in there. I can also allow people to just talk on here too if you want. Feel free to put that in Q&A if you'd rather just speak it. Otherwise, I can, let's see here. I hope we have one. Prioritizing that. That's a really good answer. So we were asked, there's finite resources and analysis. How do we get around the issue of there's so much data? Analysis paralysis is so common. How do we prioritize? To be honest, we take it in steps. Right now, very few clients are even at the point where we are fully optimizing and analyzing all the way to a starter to a student. You have to take it in steps, especially in higher ed. So many things can take months to play out. We're working with several for-profit colleges. They have 1 start per year on some programs. That is a hell of a sample size and look back window to be able to let data accumulate for maybe 11 months before we see the outcome and make any decision. You could go crazy analyzing in that amount of time. We tend to start smaller and say, you know what, our goal is to get you beyond optimizing for the lead. Why don't we just start with optimizing for interviews that are scheduled? Start with 1 milestone from the CRM that we know has a shorter window of time. So we'll work with a school and say, after someone applies or fills out an inquiry, what's the quickest thing that tends to happen no matter what? Oftentimes it'll be, we get them scheduled for a phone interview or for an in-person. Perfect. Let's measure that in the CRM and make sure that is flagged when that happens, and just start by bringing that in. Because at the end of the day, even that is miles ahead of just optimizing for the lead. What we don't want to do is immediately come in and say, great, you have 12 things that happen from application to enrollment. Let's get all of them in there and start optimizing for all of it and throw 80 reports at you, because you're absolutely right. There's not enough time to analyze all that. There are so many irons in that fire. How many of those touch points rely solely on what the admissions rep is saying, rely solely on what the financial aid ability is? All of those things, the further you get downstream post-applicant or post-lead, have more and more variables that affect the outcome. So if we can start early on with just what is the next one, let's bring that in. It's okay if we're seeing the other things and maybe someone has some free time and wants to run some analysis, but let's just optimize and start reporting on cost of the next best thing and baby step into it that way to get everyone comfortable. We've tried the whole hog approach before, Jonathan, and it did not work, candidly. It didn't work for us. It didn't work for the client, because all of a sudden admissions reps were like, whoa, where did my leads go? Why are we looking at interviews? We didn't know we had interview goals. And all of a sudden we're inundated with data on outcomes that we are not able to affect with just digital. And there was so much noise. We took a step back and said, let's just start with one milestone after the application and work through it that way to get people comfortable, to make sure the data is clean and actionable, to make sure that the outcomes are good and consistent, and just stair step it that way. Analysis paralysis, super, super easy to do. Great question. Trying to see. Probably time for one more if anyone has that. I know a few people have popped off. I was about to thank them, but then I remembered they popped off already. We will send this to everyone, recording and deck. I know there's some links here in the deck. Those of you who remain, I'll just be open and say it. We've had conversations. All of us who remain here have been talking via email, or we've met in person in a couple of cases and had some conversations. So I do appreciate you guys sticking through. I also know, because we've been having those closer conversations, that you know how to reach me. If there are things via email, you can reach right out, because we're already connected on a closer level. So I think if there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and give you a couple of minutes back. I'll go ahead and end this so we can start processing the recording. I really appreciate you guys joining me. I hope we didn't get too in the weeds with some of the coding and technical, but I invite you, if there are any questions or anything that you want our help on walking you through, please ping me on email after you look over the deck and everything. Happy to jump on the call and help out. But thank you guys very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay safe and stay healthy.